Ndabaramutsa cyane abari Kigali hano turi nijoro abakiri muri Amerika nimwiriwe. Ngiye banyita Cyusa Ntwari. I'm part of the mobilizer commissioner with the USRCA, which is the Rwandan Community Living Abroad executive team. I'm normally based in Fargo, North Dakota, but as we speak, I'm in Kigali. Here today, I'll be the moderator for this panel with esteemed guests that I'll introduce in a bit. This is a series of talks it's a campaign in the diaspora to fight genocide deniers and revisionists, and basically people that are trying to modify our history. And I think it's always an honor to see us taking the lead in not only sharing this story, but as well correcting if people trying to rewrite our own history as Rwandans. This talk is hosted by One Nation Radio, an honorable platform of a radio in the diaspora. And it's always a pleasure and honor. Here today, I won't give justice the way I'll introduce them, but I'll try to be brief because we have an attentive audience. First, I'll start with Her Excellency Ambassador Mukantabana Mathilde, who's our ambassador in the US, but as well a non-resident ambassador in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. All of us fortunate to have been living in the US for a while. We know her even prior to being an ambassador. She was very active in the academic world from California, but a lot of us are fortunate to know her just even as a very active community member of the Rwandans living in the US. Then we have Madame Murekatete Jacqueline, a genocide survivor, a human rights activist, and a practicing lawyer in New York. Also very humbled to be with her, so thank you very much. And last but not least, Professor Basaninyenzi, who's being in academia. As I was talking to him earlier, he said more than I was alive. So that's more than 3 decades for those that don't know. And also among many research he's conducted, right now he's currently conducting a research on genocide deniers living in North America. So again, today is a really on-point topic for him. Just to give an idea for our audience, the format is going to be 2 questions just to get to know better our panelists. And then each panelist is going to have questions that are specific to their field. And then we'll have concluding remarks. But before I say so, I want to also honor those of us following us virtually. You know that in an hour, we cannot give justice to such a pertinent topic, a topic that hits home to many of us. But I think our panelists are going to do their best to at least intrigue us, to expand our minds, but as well to orient us with more research that we should all do, because I know that I'm still learning, and I'm actually very keen to learn more tonight. So with that, first of all, again, extending my welcoming to all of you fellow panelists, and I'll start with the first question. So can you briefly give our audience an overview of your scope of work in the United States regarding educating Americans about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi? So I'll start maybe with you, Ambassador, and thank you.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Cyusa, for convening this meeting to discuss this very important subject. It's especially a pleasure for me to share this podium with Dr. Basaninyenzi and Jacqueline Murekatete, who in their different capacity have set an exemplary path and have relentlessly fought to bring awareness of the genocide against the Tutsi to the national and international platform. It's also a pleasure to be with you, Cyusa, who in your capacity as a community mobilizer for the USRCA is also doing a good job putting our community together. So the scope, as the question you asked, the scope of my work at the embassy has been multidimensional, as you can imagine. In general, the embassy, as a representative of our country, is a resource. It's a repository of all the information pertaining to our country, Rwanda. So people interested on the subject come to us, and we partner with people of like-minded initiatives to bring that kind of awareness. So what we have done we partner with our compatriots and friends of Rwanda in various parts of the United States and other states and other countries as well, but also within their communities and institutions. So we do it specifically through commemorative events that are held in various communities. We maintain our presence at institutions that teach Holocaust and genocide studies. For instance, even in my work, I've kept being a board member at Sonoma State University in the Holocaust and genocide studies. So we continue to keep what we're doing, but also we organize and co-organize conferences. So there are conferences that have been a mainstay on genocide and Holocaust. In my immediate memory, there are many that have taken place at the California State University, Sacramento, starting in 2004, and also in Michigan State. So there are many different things that we do as an embassy, and I'm happy to expand once we go to the subject matter. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Then I'll have Madam Murekatete, please. Thank you.
Yes, so my involvement in the genocide prevention education work has been ongoing for almost 20 years now. I began the work in 2001. And I started speaking because I realized that as a survivor, I had a responsibility to educate my fellow Americans now about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. In 1994, I lost my entire immediate family, my parents, all my 6 siblings, most of my aunts, uncles, grandparents. And coming to this country in 1995, and soon realizing that there was very little knowledge at that time, it was just a year after the genocide, there was a very little knowledge about the nature of the events that had occurred in Rwanda in 1994, that there was a genocide against the Tutsi ethnic group. And although I was still very much still struggling to deal with the consequences of the genocide as a survivor, still trying to come to terms with what had happened to me, how I had gone from being a child with parents, with grandparents, with aunts and uncles, and had found myself in an environment where I saw fellow Tutsis being murdered around me, where I saw children dying of machete wounds, where I lived every day not knowing whether or not I was going to survive to see the next day. So I had a lot of things that I was dealing with as a survivor. I had a lot of trauma, a lot of nightmares. But I also realized that, especially as a sole survivor in my family, I had a responsibility to preserve the memory of my loved ones, to educate people, and also to do my part in making sure that genocide as a crime is not something that's going to happen again in Rwanda and elsewhere. So in 2001, I had an opportunity to meet with a Holocaust survivor who came to speak to my high school class, actually. And it is him who finally motivated me even more to join him to start speaking. So between 2001 until today, I have been very active in going to middle schools, high schools, universities, churches, synagogues, national and international human rights conferences, and sharing my story of surviving the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and talking to people about the need to start doing more, to fight the ideology of genocide, to fight genocide denial, and again, to join the efforts in trying to create a world where nobody has to be systematically discriminated against, persecuted, and ultimately murdered simply because of their ethnicity or their religion or their race or their nationality, as defined by the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. In addition to speaking at schools, we also have been very involved in organizing commemorations, as Ambassador and Dr. Basaninyenzi knows. We've participated in work together to organize commemorations throughout the United States every year. And a few years ago in 2014, I started a nonprofit organization here called Genocide Survivors Foundation, whose mission is genocide prevention education and supporting survivors. So I have continued my work and I continue my work today through that nonprofit organization. And I tried to get other survivors here in the US to join me in the efforts that we've begun and will continue to undertake, again, to fight genocide ideology here and to educate people about what happened in Rwanda in 1994.
Thank you, Madam Murekatete. Dr. Gatsinzi, I'll let you answer as well this question. Thank you.
So, for full disclosure, as Anthony Murekatete would say, I'm not a genocide survivor. I was outside the country when it took place. So I was thrust in this position of educator about the genocide against Tutsi involuntarily. I was thrust in that position. Two events that I want to highlight here. In 2008, I saw a seminar on Holocaust education that was being conducted in New York City by the Olga Lengio Institute for Holocaust Education and Human Rights, and I applied. The seminar was for Holocaust educators. I did not apply to learn how to teach the Holocaust. I wanted to see how the Holocaust could enlighten me about the genocide against the Tutsi. So one of the requirements was to present a paper on how to teach the Holocaust. And I asked the director, Sondra Perlo, if I could do my presentation on the genocide against the Tutsi, and she readily accepted. After that, and so many people, the teachers, peers, fellow teachers, it was their first time listening to a presentation on the genocide against the Tutsi. So they asked me, could we invite you please to our classrooms, to our seminars and so on? I said, sure. And I became part of the Holocaust Educators Network, and they invited me to their seminars. I presented in Ohio, several times in Kentucky. In fact, in Kentucky, one of the seminars we used Frida Umuhoza's Chosen to Die, Destined to Live. And I presented in Connecticut, in Alabama, where I live. And then at one of the Kentucky seminars, I met another person who has played a prominent role in my education and my role as educator. That was Deborah Batiste. She was director of the Echoes and Reflection, a Holocaust education curriculum that is sponsored by the Anti-Defamation League. And she also started inviting me to the seminars she was conducting. I went to New York City several times to present on the genocides against the Tutsi. Now, fast forward, and I'll be very, very quickly here, fast forward to 2003, I got an email from Engineer Gatete. I don't know how he had heard about me. He was asking me if I could make a presentation on the denial of the genocide against the Tutsi. This was early in 2003. So I had 3 months. So I said, okay, I didn't know much about it. I didn't know much about the denial that was taking place, except Rusesabagina, of course. He was so prominent on the speaking circuit on college campuses. And since I had time to prepare, I accepted, did study, and actually Linda Melvern, author of Intent to Deceive, did write about 3 pages on that particular presentation. So that's how I was thrust into that position. And from then on, the Diaspora started inviting me to speak at commemorations. I spoke several times in Washington, D.C., in Michigan, Indiana, in California, in Georgia, and in Connecticut. So briefly, that's how I was thrust into, and I owned it. I owned it. Though I was thrust into it, I owned it.
Thank you. And it's always interesting because I think when you've lived in the diaspora long enough, oftentimes that's what happens. Either you're the only Rwandan in some circles, or perhaps in the area you live, you're one of the few. So I think a lot of Rwandans are gonna relate to what you're saying. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Ambassador. Do you feel that since 1994 in the US, people in your professional circles or in the different spheres you've been through over the years are more aware of the tragedy that happened almost now 27 years ago? Because as we heard even earlier, Madame Murekatete said that when she came in 1995, some weren't even aware of all of this. And just like right now, Dr. Gatsinzi said, a lot of them, even maybe that was after the Hollywood movie Hotel Rwanda, that they start realizing, oh, that happened in your country. Because I remember personally being in middle school when the Hotel Rwanda came about. And that's when suddenly a lot of my peers were asking me, were bombarding me basically with questions. So back to you again, Ambassador. Do you think that now, 27 years after the tragedy that happened in our country, do you feel that Americans in your professional circle, in your spheres in general you go through, are more aware? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiusa. I would say, and I come back to what people have said, when genocide happened, most people didn't even know where Rwanda was. So after genocide, more people didn't even know where Rwanda was. So it took a lot of teaching. And I would say that we involved our friends and colleagues in all the initiatives we undertook to deal with the devastating effects of genocide. So I give even an example how Friends of Rwanda Association, that is still active in California, came to be. It's because people came together, Americans. That's why in that particular corner, we know they know about it, because we were vocal, we were accompanied by Americans who became our friends, our anchor, our shield, because we were also bleeding, I mean. So during that time, I can say that people knew, and the places you have been, they know. But at the same time, we have also to understand this thing mutates. Whatever institution you go to, it changes. And I think we talk about it, about the future of it, especially with youth. So you can go to any institutions and you'll find maybe two people who had an experience. You'll go to one institution and you have someone who is actively against genocide denier, teaching genocide studies, but you have also someone who is denying it. We have those experiences. So it's an uphill journey we have to continue. To give you one example, for instance, there are major challenges due even to the country we live in, starting with the geography. This country is continental in scope. It's like a continent. It's a meaning that if you know people in California, Murekatete knows some in New York, and because of her reach, she can also know many people. But there are many thousands and thousands and thousands of colleges and universities. And Dr. Gatsinzi will tell you that because he has been also to many colleges and universities trying to talk about this thing. But also about the ideological differences. So for instance, here, we have a big challenge of, for instance, fighting against genocide denier because of the Constitution. A constitutional amendment, the first amendment that guaranteed the freedom of speech, is not the way, for instance, we might, other countries have taken the fight, like Germany, Austria, Rwanda, and the countries that are against the genocide denier. Here you don't have it, unless there's a crime. So as you can see, it's a major journey. So I have to just leave it there, but I'm telling you, it doesn't matter how many people know, but it's a journey we have to continue for future generations.
Thank you, Ambassador. Madame Murekatete.
I agree with the ambassador that, you know, since 1994, there have been some progress that has been made. We cannot deny that, because of us working to the country, again, we found zero knowledge about the genocide. Most people didn't even know where Rwanda was. But 27, almost 27 years later, there's been a lot of progress as a result of the efforts of, the embassy, the UN, our permanent mission here in New York, survivors like myself who have gone into schools, genocide scholars like Dr. Basaninyenzi who have gone into schools and spoke to teachers and community organizations. So all those efforts have paid off. Now, when I go into school, I'll find some people who have not heard about the genocide, but the majority of them have heard about the genocide. It's also a question about what they have heard, because that's also an issue. They may have heard about the genocide, but they don't have important facts about what happened in Rwanda in 1994, because we do have those people, as we are going to be discussing today, who are, revisionists and deniers. And when they go into these schools, they give a whole different account of what happened in 1994. So part of our education is educating the people who have no knowledge, but also who have the wrong type of knowledge as a result of being having come in contact with deniers and revisionists. But yeah, they've been progress. There are now more survivors who speak out. When I started speaking in 2001, I really didn't know any other survivors that were speaking at that time. Now we have several survivors in all different states in the US who have written books about their experience, which is very important, having that permanent content about what happened in the genocide. We have authors, like survivor authors who have published books in this country. We have nonprofit organizations, like, as I said, my own nonprofit, Genocide Survivors Foundation, Friends of Rwanda. We have other survivors organizations that are really doing a great job in the area of education and in advocacy. And we have, efforts by, again, by the embassy, by our permanent mission here. For the first time 2 years ago, as some of you, I know all of us here are aware, but speaking to our audiences, the UN in 2018 finally amended the annual commemoration to say that it was not a Rwandan genocide, which is a very incorrect and deceitful characterization of the genocide. And now, every year when we have the commemoration at the UN, the genocide is referred to as the genocide against the Tutsi, as it should. So all those progresses have come to be as a result of, survivors and Rwandans and the embassy and the mission. But at the same time, as Ambassador reminded us, there's still so much work to be done, because the movement to deny and trivialize and minimize the genocide has been growing all over the world, but in this country, and particularly over social media, as I'm sure we're going to be discussing. So because of this increasing and rising movement of deniers and revisionists, we have to step up our efforts. We have more work to do. So in some progress, but still a lot of work to be done. And that's why we're having this conversation today.
Thank you, Madam Murekatete. So Dr. Gatsinzi, I'll let you finish us off with this question. Thank you.
It's been a paradox, contradictions. So the American audience, the American public got to know about the genocide against the Tutsi through the movie Hotel Rwanda. Paradoxically, the main character upon the movie was based became one of the most insidious deniers of the genocide studies. Genocide against the Tutsis. I don't remember the year, but I wrote an article about him. By that time, he had spoken to more than 200 universities and colleges. So he was sought after. But then, because of the efforts that Ambassador, Her Excellency Ambassador and Jacqueline Murekatete talked about, because of the efforts, eventually he was unmasked. He was no longer being invited because members of the diaspora, I for one, went to one college here in Birmingham and denounced his denialism. And this was happening everywhere. So he was no longer, he did not have a speaking market. So that's a lot of progress. That's the paradox. And also, let me add quickly that long ago, I mean, when an American met Rwanda and somebody from Rwanda, the first question they asked was, are you Hutu or Tutsi? That was, everybody who knew about Rwanda knew about those identities. And today they're surprised when Rwandans tell them, I am Rwandan. They are shocked. This is a lot of progress because of the national consciousness, and things do not happen just like that. It has been through education, and they're being educated to be nationally conscious.
Thank you for this thorough answer to all of you. It's always interesting to hear that, because I for one, most of my life I grew up outside of Rwanda. And I know that usually that was some of the question I got, and being very young, I used to sometimes even wherever country I was in, I was trying to act like I was half this country I'm in, because I didn't want this question to come about. But it's been interesting, as you said, Dr. Gatsinzi, that over the years now, people are getting more used to us talking about being just Rwandan. But as well, I'll say that being from East Africa, in where I live, there's a lot of other East Africans, people from Somali, Ethiopia, South Sudan. And a lot of them, when you tell them, oh, I'm just Rwandan, they're like, but come on, I am. And they tell you who they are. And I'm like, that's good for you. In your country, maybe you have, you're proud in saying you're different, but us, we only speak in Rwanda. We have Imana, and we have one. So I say, I cannot compare. And then they look at you, they're still not convinced, but they slowly but surely can understand. And that's where we've seen, even in Rwanda, a lot of our peacekeepers, when they go to countries that are war-torn, in Central Africa, Centrafrique, or in South Sudan, a lot of times not only they come as peacekeepers, but as well, they come as well as bearers of a message of, you can be one, and you can focus on what unifies you rather than what differentiates you. And a lot of times it's being brought back to that iceberg syndrome, where just the tip perhaps is some of the differences you have, but the underlying cap is really what unifies you. And I'm glad that the Rwandan nation, with the leadership of His Excellency President Paul Kagame, has really brought us back to our ancestral culture, which was, we're one people. So with that, Ambassador, I wanted to direct to you as a question I had here. What can the Rwandan diaspora learn from other genocide survivors of other diasporas, such as maybe the Jewish diaspora, the Armenian diasporas, and other diaspora that pretty sure you've worked with? And then the follow-up question would be, do Rwandans in the US work already in partnership with these communities? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyusa. I have to start by saying there's almost enormous instinctive affinity and feelings of kinship among groups who went through a devastating genocide. So when we talk about the never again, that is an all too familiar slogan, but it's also an aspirational idea that can only be reached through collective efforts. So many people come together across board because they have similar experiences. So the communities you mentioned have been the torchbearers in the fight against genocide ideology in general and genocide denial. As you probably remember, it's only recently, after a lengthy and protracted struggle, that the US Congress finally agreed to accept the Armenian genocide, just recently. And Armenian genocide is one of the oldest. It happened even before the Holocaust, as you know. So our lesson number one, if there's any lesson to draw from this, is that the fight to establish historical truth, especially regarding genocide, will never be smooth, even by the case of the Armenian. So, and it's not for the faint-hearted. It's not for people who are going to quit midway. It's something, it's a journey. It's like what Murekatete and what Dr. Gatsinzi were talking about. It's a continuous journey. It has to happen. Number two, the most important point also I would put there is the power of organization and partnerships, because they are paramount, because you can't do it alone. There's no way you can fight. It's a scourge. of genocide, attending genocide ideology and denial. So it's part and parcel of the same thing. So as people who went themselves through all the different stages of genocide, they have a more heightened sense of skewed versions of history. And as such, they also understand what we are going through. So that's why we always align ourselves with them. Since 1994, we have partnered with all these groups you mentioned to lend strength to each other. Many works to end genocide, for instance, that took place across the United States and other parts, I'm sure, were always organized by these groups. It was not just by people protesting against genocide against Tutsi, but also Armenian. Not too long ago, I participated in a million people's march on the bridge of San Francisco. That was an Armenian genocide. So we all work together. And one of the last things maybe I can say is even conferences we've been organizing that Murekatete talked about and I talked about, most of the time it's Holocaust and genocide conferences. So we try to put them together. Sometimes we can highlight Rwanda, but at the same time, we always try to show the commonalities of our experiences. And I have also to tell you in physical terms, for instance, the place I was telling you about, Sonoma State, all the survivors of genocide. We're still fighting with them to call it genocide against Tutsi, and they finally did it at a high cost because they understand what we are promoting in this particular thing. So what I'm telling you is that we can't do it alone. We do it together, and wherever we are also doing commemorations in our communities, we always encourage people in our communities to also partner with similar groups. And the places I've been to, we do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And this is very true because I know that when you think of the Armenian genocide being the first in the 20th century, and then the genocide against the Tutsi being the last, it's beautiful to see that we join arms. And I remember growing up, always being touched when I would go to a Iwuka ceremony and see a Jewish rabbi or an Armenian person coming, a Bosnian, a Cambodian, people coming and basically share about their story. And oftentimes, I like what you said, Ambassador, about that immediate kinship. You don't need to explain, but I know as well as either a bit like Dr. Gatsinzi, how he started saying, I wasn't in Rwanda when the genocide against the Tutsi took place, but I had relatives. And it was interesting to see other communities relating how you're talking about 1904, or I mean, the beginning of the 20th century, and some Armenians are way distant, but still have that connection. So that's good to know this. So thank you, Ambassador, for sharing. Madam Murekatete, I wanted to ask you, now that we're talking about genocide deniers, revisionists, and thinking about your field, what legal tools are readily available for people living in the US to use to fight against genocide deniers and revisionists? And has there been maybe even any case of such people brought to justice in the US? Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, as Ambassador brought up in the introduction, there are no laws that criminalizes genocide or Holocaust denial in US, unfortunately. This is unlike, many countries in Europe, unlike Rwanda, unlike Israel. And this is as a result, as our Ambassador mentioned, as a result of the First Amendment to the US Constitution protection. A lot of people in this country believe that Holocaust genocide denial is simply part of protected speech. So this is why you can have, rallies here and see people carrying Nazi flags and see people carrying Ku Klux Klan flags and saying Jews will not replace us, as happened in Virginia, as happened most recently when the US Capitol was stormed. There are many Americans who believe that this is protected. This type of denial language is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So that's it's a huge hurdle for those of us, those Rwandans and other genocide prevention activists who live here in the U.S. But I do like to say that just because there's no law that criminalizes genocide denial per se in this country, and there have been no prosecutions of genocide or Holocaust deniers because of the First Amendment protections, there are other laws, U.S. laws that we can use to shed light on genocide, the crime of genocide. And here I'm talking about asylum and citizenship laws. We do have laws in the U.S. that were meant to prevent genocidaires and Nazis from entering this country. Meaning that and we know that most of the genocidaires and Nazis who have found safe haven in these countries came here as asylees. They applied asylum, claiming to be victims of the Holocaust or of the genocide against the Tutsi instead of perpetrators. Now we have these laws that if you lie about your involvement or your activities during a genocide, and later on it is found that you lied on asylum application about your involvement in genocide, even if you're a U.S. citizen, that citizenship can be stripped away from you. It will be stripped away from you. So in the past several years, we've had a couple cases of genocidaires who participated in the genocide against the Tutsi, who have been prosecuted for asylum fraud. We've had the case of, some of you know, Beatrice Munyenyezi in New Hampshire, which is a state here in the US. We've had a case of, we had a case actually 2 years ago in 2009, Leonard Teganya in Boston, in Massachusetts. These are all, genocidaires who participated in the genocide against the Tutsis, came to this country, lied on their application that they're victims, and then later on, people learned that they were genocidaires, they're not victims. And Beatrice was sentenced, both of them have been sentenced now for asylum fraud, and they're serving sentences here in the US with the expectation that once they complete those sentences for asylum fraud, they will be extradited to Rwanda, where they can then face the genocide charges, where they can be held accountable for their participation in the genocide. So while we don't have, a law that criminalizes denial, we can use these laws, I feel, to mobilize and to lobby and make sure that the genocidaires who live here in this country, and unfortunately there are many. Every other day I speak to survivor and they would tell me, oh, I know a genocidaire who lives in Ohio. I know a genocidaire who lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I know a genocidaire who lives in Buffalo, New York, and all parts of this country. So part of our efforts to fight deniers is establishing that there was a genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. It has been established, but continuing to reminding people that there are people who committed these crimes and have found safe haven in countries like these ones. And when people are prosecuted and found guilty for genocide, it contributes to genocide prevention. It contributes to fighting deniers who go around saying that there was no genocide. So I do believe that this is one of the ways that we can really become more active in this country, is using these US asylum and citizenship laws to make sure that the genocidaires who are here are apprehended and brought to justice. The other thing I can mention, in light of the lack of a law that criminalizes genocide denial, is that another tool that I feel that we need to start using more is really lobbying and advocating and lobbying private companies, particularly technology and social media companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, to start changing their policies to remove content that denies the genocide against the Tutsi. Just last year, in 2020, October 2020, after 10 years, as our ambassador said, this is not an easy war. It's not a short war, and it's not going to be a short war. But after 10 years of lobbying by the Anti-Defamation League, which is one of the biggest Holocaust education and organization that fights anti-Semitism in this country, after 10 years of efforts and lobbying by ADL and other Holocaust education organizations, Facebook agreed to update their hate crime policy to include Holocaust denial. Initially, Facebook had resisted, saying Holocaust denial is part of free speech, is protected by the First Amendment. But after so much rallying, now they upgraded their hate crime policy, and now when people deny the Holocaust on Facebook, such content is removed. This is a decision that was made by the Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, after a lot of lobbying. So it's really an opportunity for us also to reach out to private companies like those, especially social media, which has become the main platform for genocide deniers, to reach out to companies like Facebook and say, okay, here you're saying that Holocaust denial is not allowed, such content is not allowed on Facebook, but you should also apply that policy to the genocide against the Tutsi, because this is also a genocide that has been recognized internationally as the Holocaust has as a genocide. So while we don't have the law that we would like to have, we can use the existing laws and policies to really lobby and make sure that those people who deny the genocide against Tutsi are held accountable in one way or another.
Thank you, Madam Murekatete, and I really appreciate you encouraging us to remember that our voice matters, and as well to lobby, because when you think of, perhaps the US doesn't have a law per se, but when you think of Facebook, it's almost a nation within a nation, because over 1 billion of people on Facebook. So I really appreciate you reminding us that maybe in the country you live, there's not a law per se, but platforms such as social media, which are nations, technology nations, spreading around the globe, it's good to remember that they have policies, and policies are not rigid. Policies are always fluid. And if you put the adequate kind of strength and push, they can change. So thank you for sharing that. With that, Dr. Gatsinzi, my question to you is, can you share about the comprehensive research you have conducted over the negationists living in the US? And the follow-up question would be, how can our US Rwandan diaspora organize to systematically and scholarly fight back revisionist authors? Thank you.
Let me first compliment Ambassador's comment on the kinship between the genocide that was perpetrated against the Tutsis and that against the Armenians and Jews. I'm a prime example of somebody who has been sponsored by Jewish organizations. In the Olga Lengio Institute sponsored me to do a study tour of Holocaust concentration extermination camps in Poland, paid for me and the other teachers to tour historical sites of Israel. The ADL, Anti-Defamation League, paid for me, sponsored me to study at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Institute. So they see there is that natural kinship, as Ambassador pointed out. The studies I have done, before my 2003 presentation on denial of the genocide against the Tutsi, I had actually contributed a chapter to a book that was published by the University of Illinois. The chapter was about the Hamitic myth. And I studied people, travelers' accounts like Richard Burton, John Speake, Henry Stanley. The theory that Tutsis were foreigners in Rwanda and that they had migrated to Rwanda, invaded and conquered the natives, the Hutus and the Twas. This, of course, was a myth. And as we recall, Leo Mugesera's infamous speech, he said, we are going to throw you in the Nyabarongo River to return you by the quickest way to Ethiopia, where you came from. So that was something that was for therapy particularly, try to understand ununderstandable, the horrific things that you cannot comprehend. When the genocide happened, it was very, very, very hard to comprehend how human beings can turn into murderers of their neighbors. So it was for me kind of therapy, but it got published and so on. But since 2003, I have been studying deniers of the genocide against the Tutsis. And it's interesting that I have among them, of course, they're imposters like Rusesabagina, who claim to be genocide survivors. And this gives them, to the unsuspecting audience, this gives them credibility. And so the first thing is to unmask them. Number one is the diaspora. I'm taking your questions together. The diaspora has done and should continue to do that whenever there are people like this speaking. They are on YouTube, they are invited to speak, is to go and unmask them and tell them, hey, you are not survivors. The genocide, there was a group that was targeted. You are not part of that group. So that's number one. And then I realized there were also academics like Christian Davenport, Alan Stam, Edward Herman. These use a coded language. They will not say they are deniers. They will say the Rwandan genocide, the genocide in Rwanda, but they will never, ever say the genocide that was committed against the Tutsis. So this again is our function, and that's what I'm doing in my writings, and the diaspora can do the same thing, is to decode them, deconstruct them, and expose their false narratives. They will say the Kigali version. There are no versions. There are no versions of the genocide. The genocide is a fact. It's something that is not something that should be taught, but something that should not be debated. Facts are not debated. And then, of course, we have ICTR lawyers who lost their cases, and now they want to plead their case in public. People like Christopher Black, people like John Philpott, they are in Canada. These are people like Peter Erlinda. Peter Erlinda was an academic. He was fired later on, but he was also at the ICTR. These are people, sour grapes, so to speak. They lost their cases, but they want to perpetuate their lies. And of course, we have also what I call pseudo journalists, people like Stowe and Jude River more recently. So we need to expose, deconstruct them, show the false narratives, and this can be done not only in writings, but in activism. When you go and ask disturbing questions, that is activism, and that's a role that our diaspora can play in exposing these people. Exposing, calling them out, and denouncing.
Thank you, Dr. Gatsinzi. It's always good to remind us that the name that Madam Murekatete reminded us that was passed at the UN of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. It's crucial and paramount because when you think even of the steps in the genocide, words are one of the steps that are essential when you humanize the other group. When you make sure that the humanity is removed, but first you start with words. And when you think in Rwanda, they were called snakes, cockroaches, rats for Jews. And I'm pretty sure in Cambodia, there was other names, but everything starts with words. So I can definitely know how it matters. And when people obviously are trying to play around, I love the way you brought up the whole coded, because sometimes it's not as blatant, it's more subtle. So with that, Ambassador, I have my second question for you. And coming from me, I'm pretty sure it's no surprise. I wanted to ask you, what is the role of the youth and the generations born after 1994 on picking up the baton in this noble fight against revisionism? And we say this because I don't know by heart percentages, but as you know, in Rwanda and also in the diaspora, the youth born after 1994 are becoming almost the majority of, Rwandans. So that's my question to you. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Kyusa. I would wish to ask you the same question, but I'm going to try to give whatever I can because you are youth and you've been doing it. Obviously, from our discussion, we know that genocide was ended in 1994, but the genocide ideology didn't end. It's alive and well. The crime of genocide doesn't expire. So, and the second point maybe I want to make is that Rwanda has invested in its youth, and the youth of Rwanda have been disappointed. I think someone mentioned the whole fact, for instance, Dr. Gatsinzi was talking about going and to hearing somebody talking about who are you, I'm Hutu, I'm Tutsi, I'm Munyarwanda. So we've gotten to a point where the youth who have been nurtured by the hard work of our leadership and the resilience of our people in general have transformed what I call a wounded memory. Our wounded memory was transformed into a fertile ground from which we draw strength. We draw strength from that and lessons as well. So when we talk about youth, I would say they are at a turning point. They are no longer prisoners of divisionism that our generation went through. Just even based upon what we were saying. And the reality, the youth, the people who are coming, they are better equipped intellectually, ideologically, intellectually, and more connected to the world, where the fight needs to take place. So as such, here in the United States and especially in Rwanda as well, the youth is called to build on the lessons learned, but especially also to adapt those lessons to our changing world. We need to change the way you give those lessons and how we can fight the fight. The nature of revisionism is adapting into malicious ways, like what they have said. I think you mentioned about Facebook, many different ways. And it kills the mind, it goes into the mindset. The mindset of genocide deniers is being promoted through technology, for instance. So one of the things that I would enjoin the youth to fight against denial, number one, there's a need to introduce creative and innovative means of making the history of genocide accessible through technology, because we go by technology. So we can no longer use the same type of medium. So we can do that. We can leverage the arts to introduce a new medium of communication on the history of genocide and to involve wider audience, something that is more palatable to the wider audience. We need to stay ahead, a step ahead of the misinformation that is spreading across social media by being proactive in the genocide history and to occupy the place. If you don't occupy the space, people are going to occupy that space and drown those voices of deniers. The last one I want to touch on is organize, organize, organize. And more importantly, build bridges with like-minded allies such as the youth where you live, Somalian youth, but also the youth of the people we've been talking about, like Jewish populations, Armenian and other people who went through genocide. And then work on partnership based on mutual beneficial projects. That is it's when you are working something tangible together. It's not so much about talking. And there are many of those projects that we can talk about. So I would think that the youth are in a better place now to carry the fight against genocide denial with the tools at their disposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And it's always good for people to remember that when you think even of the genocide against the Tutsi when it happened, when you think of Interahamwe, the people that were out there killing, a lot of them sadly were the youth. So usually in a nation, in a healthy nation, usually the youth are used to do things that build a country. But sadly, in 1994, the Rwandan youth back then, a certain group, Interahamwe, were used to actually destroy the nation. But as well, it's always interesting to remember that in 1997, there was at the Inyange High School, youth that committed a heroic act where they were the guardian of Ubunyarwanda, where basically people stormed a high school in 1997, again, after the genocide against the Tutsi, and said, Tutsis and Hutu, separate, because they, I think FDLR, that were on the Congolese side, when they stormed on the Rwandan border, that high school, and they wanted the youth to be divided, they said, no, we're just Abanyarwanda. And sadly, some of them were even lost their life for that. And in Rwanda, we have a level of honoring people. And I think they got the medal of Imena. So that's what gives me hope that youth can also commit heroic acts. So with that, I'll go to you, Madame Murekatete, and ask you, as a founder and president of your foundation, how does your Genocide Survival Foundation equip survivors to cope with the revisionism and negationist groups? And how important is it for survivors to speak up? And can survivors sharing their story impact their mental health? It's a many layered question, sorry about that, but I really think it's important to know that, again, I speak for myself, I wasn't there. And even I, as a Rwandan, it's a toll emotionally, spiritually on even me. So I can imagine as a survivor, that's another level. So that's why I really wanted to see what you can tell us on this matter. Thank you, Madame Murekatete.
Thank you. Yeah, so, the mission of Genocide Survivors Foundation is twofold. Is genocide prevention education and raising funds to support the most vulnerable survivors in the areas of education, economic empowerment, and social services. So in the area of education, some of the activities that we do engage in is, as I mentioned earlier, is go to schools, middle schools, high schools, universities, churches, synagogues, wherever we're invited, and sharing our testimonies of surviving the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. And other activities that we engage in is organizing annual commemorations here in New York, and try to partner with other survivors in other states throughout the US to organize annual commemoration. This is one of the progresses actually that we've have. Initially there was a commemoration with the embassy, there was one in New York with the UN, but now, as we are into 2021, every year there are so many more states where members of the Rwandan diaspora survivors are organizing commemorations, educating their respective communities about the genocide. And this is critically important because, as our ambassador said at the beginning, the US is like a continent. So I can organize a program here in New York, but I don't necessarily reach somebody who's in Utah or somebody who's in Iowa or in Montana. So it is very essential for us as members of the diaspora to really connect with Rwandans living in every state, in all the states of the US, and help them to start organizing and educating their relative communities about the genocide. So we organize annual commemoration programs. One of the things that we're in the process of also doing is establishing a speakers bureau for survivors in different states to join, where they can, again, have a bigger reach. We can have a bigger reach throughout the US in these efforts to educate people. Now, as to the importance of survivors speaking up and how critical it is, it's critically important because, based on my experience, when over the past 20 years that I've been going and speaking to different audiences, young and old, the response has always been a very positive one. And people have thanked me many times told me how it's the first time they've heard actual survivors speak about the genocide. And it's one thing to read about what happened or to see a video clip in the media about what happened, to actually have a survivor in a classroom come and talk about, you know, how the genocide was planned and how it was executed and the consequences that it has had of our lives is very, it's very important. This is one of the main ways the Holocaust education centers have used to educate people, even now to continue to educate people about the Holocaust, is sending survivors, they are elderly survivors of the Holocaust now who are still going to schools and share their experiences, because they recognize that although it's decades since the Holocaust, the denial movement, anti-Semitism is still on the rise. So having survivors' voices as part of this genocide prevention education is certainly critical. The last part of your question was about, you know, how survivors sharing their story can impact their mental health. Of course, as you yourself acknowledged, it's very difficult in many ways to have to recount the horrors that we witnessed in 1994, to have to recount the losses and the pain that we suffered. I mean, this is a pain that, you know, remains with us 27 years later and will remain with us for as long as we live. You know, they say time heals, in some sense that's true, but there are some things that never heal. And each stage of our lives brings different types of, you know, pains and sadness. So speaking about and sharing, you know, our stories of survival is critically important. It's something that I try to encourage fellow survivors to undertake. I recognize that every survivor has a way of healing, and people who are speaking, some people started speaking in 2001, like myself, others are having the courage to start speaking now, others will take, you know, 5 more years from now to speak. And, you know, everybody has to be given their room to heal and to have the space that they need to heal and before they come sharing their stories. But, you know, many, it definitely helps you in a positive way in your healing, because at the end of the day, you can, you know, try to repress what happened to you, try to pretend that it didn't happen as a way to try to cope. But at the end of the day, when you go through genocide, as I said, it's not something that you can never get over. So sooner or later, those memories, those losses are going to come to haunt you. So it's very important that we really provide a platform and a space for survivors who are willing now and who will be willing in the future to start participating in this work. Because obviously, as people who suffered so much during the genocide, we have to be at the forefront of preserving the memory of our loved ones and again, trying to create a Rwanda and a world where such a crime does not continue to happen.
Thank you, Madam Murekatete. And it's always great to remember that obviously not everyone is gifted like some of you on this call to be eloquent and to be able to write about a tragedy like the one our country went through. But I know it's also therapeutical. People have said to talk, therapeutical to write, as well therapeutical to do in an artistic way. Some people paint, some people do theater. So I'm always glad that people are exploring many different avenues and platforms to get this, you know, deeply sometimes suppressed emotion, memory, or story to tell. But I think everyone has a story to tell and everyone should be given in whatever way is adequate to them, that opportunity. But like you said as well, it's not a matter of now or when, but it's whenever the person is ready, because it's not for everyone. Now I'll turn to Dr. Gatsinzi with his second question. What is the role of academia in shaping the research lens on a sensitive topic like the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda? Thank you.
First, we have to remember that genocide deniers never want to admit that they are deniers. No denier admits being called that. So the task of academia, as I said earlier, is in my area. My area is language and literature. So in language and literature, the task, the burden is to decode them, to analyze the choice of words they're using. For example, a cover of book may have genocide on it, but then throughout the text you have conflict, you have war, and so on. So these are already indicators. These are already signifiers that this person, let me read him carefully, let me read her carefully, they're up to something malicious. Of course, that's in the language area. There are other lenses. My friend Jean-Pierre Karegeya, who is very eclectic, uses many lenses, an interdisciplinary approach. He uses theology, he uses philosophy, he uses post-colonial literature. Another, somebody I have not seen in a long time, Charlie Mironko, we did go to school together, undergraduate, a long time ago. He has used the anthropological lens. Josias Mujaga at the University of Montreal, he uses testimonial literature that is survivors' memoirs. So our task is to look at all genocides have common denominators. It's the intent to exterminate a group of people based on ethnicity, religion, or whatever identity, but there are particulars. And when you point out these particulars, you are already preempting genocide deniers. And so it consists in unmasking them, because their role is to mask, to conceal their intent. And I like Linda Mervin's book, Intent to Deceive. That's really their intention.
Thank you, Dr. Gatsinzi. And it's always great to see, like you said, academia being used for the greater good, and as well authors coming together in somewhat of a concert to do greater good. And I'm always reminded that after the tragedy that happened in Rwanda in 1994, the genocide against the Tutsi, led by a Senegalese author, Boubacar Boris Diop, many African authors went to Rwanda to really try to understand, because it was really hard, numbers, statistics, seeing things on TV, but they went and trying to understand. And I remember it was in French. I grew up being taught in French. So to those listening, if you want to go see Boubacar Boris Diop, but it's in French. And it was saying on how when they got to Rwanda as African authors interested in what happened in Rwanda, of all countries, and they were coming from countries where there's actual ethnic groups speaking different languages and having different origins, even within the same country. Rwanda was actually, we said, the country where there's no ethnic groups. So even him, and I remember as a Rwandan coming from another mouth of another fellow African, it was so powerful, because sometimes you end up as Rwandan trying to justify and people don't understand you. So it's always, I think, good to see other academicians and other authors, non-Rwandans, but with good intentions behind it. With that, we'll enter the concluding part. Once again, it's hard to give justice on such a monumental topic, but for the in reason of time, we'll move into the conclusion. So I'll turn it back to you, Ambassador, with what final message do you want our attentive audience to take away to conclude this fruitful panel on the importance of fighting genocide deniers? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Chusa, I would like to say that most of, we've touched on many different things, but maybe we can live together is, genocide happened almost 27 years ago, but our world is still threatened by the ugly tentacles of its ideology. So, and the denial has taken on many different forms. You know, the people who have killed not only systematically tried to exterminate the Tutsi people, but they also continue to be the torchbearers of genocide denial across the globe. And they, at the same time, sowing the seeds of hatred in our world, wherever we might be. And the other thing is that, especially when we're talking about what we can do as human beings, as the young people, we find overflow of YouTubers here in the United States. Yesterday, I was watching one who pretended to be genocide survivors, but who are in fact pandering genocide ideology and denial. So denial occupied the central stage during genocide. It occupied the central stage. So denial, even though they call it the last stage, is always present during genocide, after genocide, and even prior to genocide. But it's present today in many countries. Then don't deem necessary to arrest, for instance, genocide survivors, and who are roaming free and spewing their venom wherever they are. It's present today in many institutions, like what Murekatete or Gatsinzi have talked about. It's present, even in our own country. More and more we are seeing people who are starting again to talk about that like it was a non-consequential thing, even then. So what I can say is that we have the historical truth on our side. The genocide against the Tutsi is unequivocal, undeniable, indisputable. And I think that, Professor Gatsinzi talked about it, that, I don't need to go back on this. So what I can finish with is that I call on all of us to stand together for our humanity and fight against genocide and genocide denial. We must increase cooperation and partnerships to confront this evil. It's evil. We must remain alert and dare to speak out when people are attempting to rewrite and scramble our history. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Madam Murekatete.
Yes, similarly, my final message to those of us who are listening to us is really to recognize that genocide as a crime, as I always say when I speak, is the worst crime that human beings can commit against other human beings. Because to be systematically discriminated against, to be persecuted, to be hunted day and night as if you're an animal, to be systematically murdered simply because of who you are, simply because of something that you did not choose to be, is the worst crime that there is. There's no greater crime. This is why genocide has been accurately referred to as a crime of crimes. So I want our audiences to really recognize that this is a crime that should concern all of us. It's a concern that is in all our national interests, in humanity's interest, to prevent, and to also recognize the consequences, the human consequences of genocide. Because sometimes people see genocide as something that happens over there to those people, but really the consequences that it has on people's lives. As I mentioned to you earlier, as an aside conversation, I'm now a mom of two children. One is 4, the other one is 2 months old, and I think about the day they are going to ask me about their grandparents, their maternal grandparents, about their maternal aunts, and having to have that conversation, letting them know that they don't have maternal grandparents, they don't have maternal aunts, maternal uncles. Thankfully, they are lucky to have maternal grandparents because my husband still has his parents, but most of my survivor friends, their children don't have a single grandparent on either side. And these children are going to grow up not even having the love that grandparents lived. You have survivors in Rwanda now who were 1 or 2 during the genocide, and they're growing up now, coming of age, without even a photograph of their dad, of their mom. They don't know how their parents looked like. So this is what the genocide is a systematic planning and extermination. The intent is to total destruction of a people, of a memory. And all of us have to really recognize that in this day and age, this is not something that should be happening. And also reminding people, as we've been mentioning throughout this conversation, that genocide denial is an essential part of genocide perpetration. It is a stage in the genocide process, as our ambassador just mentioned, so that fighting genocide denial and revisionism is an essential part of genocide prevention work. And it is work that I really call on all our audiences, you know, whether they are young, whether they are middle-aged, whether they are old, whether they are Black or white or Jewish or Muslim. Again, the crime of genocide is something that is in all our interest to prevent. So I urge them to be educated about what genocide is and what is not, because that's one of the ways that, as we discussed, that deniers try to spread their message, is trying to say, you know, this happened, but it didn't happen this way. It's not always the genocide didn't happen. There's subtle ways that they deny the genocide. So we have to educate ourselves. What is genocide? How does it happen? How is it planned? How is it executed? And what is not genocide? So when people start talking about this was also a genocide or double genocide, we let them know that there is no evidence that is supporting evidence that that's a genocide. So educate yourself. I call on Rwandan youth, especially as a future generation, and as a, you know, tomorrow's leaders, as, you know, Rwandan Wejo, to really educate themselves, you know, meet genocide survivors, visit genocide memorials, visit CNLG, which has conducted extensive research on how the genocide against Tutsi happened. Be educated so that when people start telling you that things did not happen the way it happened, you have a response. You have the tools to respond to them. You have the tools to respond to denial and revisionism. There are many books, great books that have been written. Dr. Gatsin's mentioned, you know, The Intent to Deceive by Linda Melverne. She also wrote a book called The Conspiracy to Murder and A People Betrayed, all of which talk about the planning and the execution of the genocide against the Tutsis. And of course, there are many survivors who have written books. Here in the US, we have, you know, Consuelo Nishimwe, who wrote Tested to the Limit. We have in the School of Resiliency by Frida Muhoza. We have Genocide by Reverie Rangwa. Many, many books. Really, anybody who's listening and want to, you know, get more recommendations about what books they should be reading, they can certainly contact me through Genocide Survivors Foundation too, and I'll be happy to send those recommendations. But really get educated so that way these you can join the fight that we are all in, of trying to fight these people who are trying to deny or in one way or another trivialize the genocide against the Tutsis. So it's really the work of each and every one of us. I hope that nobody will listen to this conversation and feel that, okay, this does not concern me. This is not my problem. I hope that everybody will really feel the need to join us in this fight, because as we said from the beginning, this is not something that can easily accomplished, but with enough efforts, with enough persistence, this is definitely a war that we're going to win, a war against genocide denial, because as our ambassador just said, the truth is on our side. And in Kinyarwanda, we always say that, what is the saying? So ultimately, the truth will triumph, but we have to do the work that is involved in letting Americans and people all over the world know about the nature of the events that happened in Rwanda in 1994, about the genocide against the Tutsi.
Thank you, Madam Murekatete. Dr. Gatsinzi, I'll let you reply to the answer as well. Thank you.
So I will probably repeat much of what has been said before. And this is not bad, it's for emphasis, repetition is never bad. My message is twofold. First, we should not be fatigued to talk about, to denounce denial of the genocide against the Tutsi. It will never end. It will take new forms, and we need to be sophisticated, more sophisticated than genocide deniers, because, so it will always be there, that is in the scholarship on genocide. I had somebody in Rwanda who happens to be a genocide survivor saying, we are tired of this, never again, never. I heard that. It was horrific. So that'll be a tragedy in itself. My second message is to the young people. I like the educational system here in America. That's what I've been part of for much of my life. there is a component of education they call general education. The first 2 years you study the humanities, composition 1 or 2, literature, sociology, psychology. This is to train a thinking person, somebody with critical thinking skills. So our young people need to be critical thinkers so that they are not gullible, they are not susceptible to misinformation. And there is something, there are 2 terms we have in teaching: gnosis, which is knowing, and praxis. Now that we know, what do we do? This is the activism we were talking about. You don't, if you have knowledge, it's in the Bible, there is a parable of keeping a light under a bushel. That is what it is. If you have knowledge and you don't act on that knowledge, then you are wasting what has been invested in you, because education is investment. So in ending, I would like to add to the readings Ms. Murekatete gave us, the memoirs, survivors' memoirs. Those who are visual learners can watch Ghosts of Rwanda. It's a PBS documentary. The movie, I like the movie. We wish to inform you that, no, not movie, but sometimes in April. Sometimes in April is a movie that's very, very informative. And another book that I recommend is We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed. This book has particular resonance with me because some of the people in it are people I knew, people, relatives who were killed at the at a mission, at Seventh Advent mission called Ngoma. So my message again, to not be fatigued and to be critical thinkers and activists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gatsinzi. That was actually going to be my last follow-up question. Was Madam Murekatete already alluded to a list of reliable, credible sources, but I wanted to give you as well the opportunity, Ambassador, if there is any websites, books, documentaries, movies that you really recommend, because again, in the times where there's abundance of resources on the World Wide Web, but as well in any technology we all use, it's good to know what is recommended by you, Ambassador, and as well, like some of the panelists already mentioned, what are the sources that you deem credible? Thank you.
Thank you, Chusa. But it's quite strange, but what I was going to say has been mentioned. Linda Melvin, the movie of all times I love is Sometimes in April. It's something that I think represents, it represented the complexity of what happened during genocide. Maybe I can add also the 600. It's 600 is new, but I think now people can get access to the movie. And then recommend also that people read also the testimonies by survivors, Konsole Ishimwe, Immaculée Iribagiza, many different ones. We have many. I can't name all of them because I don't have them in front of me, but we have many young people who have written. As a matter of fact, what I loved when we did the last conference in Michigan, at the University of Michigan, was to see many people bringing their own testimonies in forms of books. So we have quite a few. I even just recently got a book written for the children, how to teach genocide to children, to younger children. It was published, I think it was released last month by Murangwa from Canada. And I think it's something I was going to also encourage people. And we'll try, one of the things that the embassy is also trying to do, or we could do for people who write, is that we can also introduce them to the Library of Congress and see that our books are there. So we are going to rely on people like Murekatete and Dr. Gatsinzi, because they know those people who are writing and the ones that are credible. And then we'll be able to make sure as possible to be to make them accessible to many people. And so that will be where I can leave it there. But all the books they have mentioned, I like them.
Oh, so thank you, Ambassador Mukantabana. Thank you, Madam Murekatete, and thank you as well, Professor Gatsinzi. What an insightful hour, and I'm also so grateful to our attentive audience. This series of talk, this is the first of many hosted by One Nation Radio. But again, as we started off, we said there's no way we can give justice to the scope of work, the monument that this topic is, but we just tried in an hour and some minutes to incite you, and as well to invite you to learn more, invite you to educate yourself, but as well invite you to create circles and spaces when people can have such needed talks. It's always good to remember to thank people around us in official roles like Ambassador Mukantabana, but as well seeing from the academic lens where Dr. Gatsinzi for the last 3 decades has been spearheading different initiatives, and as well seeing the selflessness of sometimes there's our fight as Rwandans, our fight as part of the diaspora, but as well to build those bridges with others that led the fight perhaps before us, such as the Jewish community, such as the Armenian community, to learn from the best, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And some of them have already mastered some legal avenues. And that's where, speaking of legal, you can think of Madame Murekatete Jacqueline, when she even talked about the 10 years fight of the Jewish community in one of their biggest lobbies. So again, it's to say that it's not a one-person a fight, it's a community fight, but as well as a fight where you build bridges with other communities that are leading this fight. I want to also thank all of you, because it's always interesting in your official roles, but as well in your community member roles, and in also your roles as of Rwandan origin. It's a fight that you haven't even chosen, but yet you're fighting it. So that's something I commend all of you for doing this. And as you know, in our dear mother tongue, they say that izina ni ry'umuntu, and I want to reassure you that ikivi cyanyu tuzacyusa. And I think we don't, it's not even just from a perspective of decisions. It's a must, it's a duty, and we stand upon your shoulders of giants. But we're very fortunate once again with the nation we have, with the leadership we have in place in Rwanda, and also in the Rwandan diaspora. I know that this fight will win it. And eventually, even those that were on the other side, denying, on the other side, questioning, on the other side, creating some revisionism, they'll see that it's no longer something that is acceptable. And it's been interesting to see even some people, notable people that were once on one side of the aisle, the wrong side, obviously, and now are either even physically back in Rwanda or just now leading the fight on our side. So I'm very hopeful. And I really, once again, want to thank all of you panelists for taking some time out of your precious day. I want to thank our attentive audience, but as well want to reinvite all of you to please, in such difficult times, remember to take care of the precious person you see every day in the mirror, because by taking care of yourself, you're going to be able to take care of the community. But taking care of yourself, you're going to be able to serve this honorable country we call Rwanda. Nk'uko rero nkaba mbashimira cyane kandi mbifuriza umunsi mwiza, kandi Imana y'u Rwanda ikomeze kubana namwe. Murakoze.